Hey everybody, we're back at it in Proverbs chapter 14, verse 31. Let's read it together. Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him. Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker. Why is that? Why is it if you oppress someone who's poor, you're insulting God? Not the man, but God. Well, the reason is, we're all made in the image of God. Genesis tells us that God made us all in his image. Therefore, every person, regardless of your status, is valuable and worthwhile before God. So for you to come and oppress, that word just means to press down or to crush, it can even mean. To do that to somebody that God made in his image, you're insulting God in that way and acting as if this person is not as good as you. Now, this term oppress gets thrown around a lot today, and there are lots of folks that want to argue over its definition and what it means, and we have lots of differences over how to understand that, but we really, as Christians, ought to have a unique perspective on things that touch the social and especially the political. So I'm going to look today at 5 attitudes that we can have towards the poor, none of which are right. I don't know if they all amount to oppression, but they can lead to that kind of thing. And you and I are very rarely going to have the opportunity to actually oppress somebody, but I want to look at the attitudes that are behind that. And some of these, you're probably going to really agree with. You're like, yeah, get them, Tyler, but then I'm going to say the one that's yours, and you're going to say, well, you haven't thought through this. Just take the time and listen. All of these are addressed in Scripture, and all of them are things that we should avoid. So let's look at this. 5 bad attitudes that we have toward the poor. And they all start with I. That's very cool. I was able to do that. They all start with I. Number 1, here's go to the far negative side. We are indignant towards the poor. This is the person that just condemns the poor, that thinks that the reason they're poor is because they're lazy, because they've done something wrong. You can even start to think that rich is a blessing and poor is a curse from the Lord. And when you see folks on TV of a different class or of a different kind of person or a different nation, you feel that anger rising inside of you. We see this in countries like India with the caste system, right? And other places too, where somebody's at the bottom because they belong at the bottom. Therefore, we shouldn't do anything for them. They deserve what they get. And, there are some folks on TV or online that want to whip you up into that kind of attitude. And I think we can all understand that's wrong. You should not feel that way about those that are poor. They have not been there because they deserve it. It's much more complicated than that. And Jesus would talk about that some. But let's move up a little bit. Number 2, you might be impatient toward the poor. This is somebody that is like, look, I don't hate poor people, but look, we got to face fact. It's your fault that you're there, right? And the person that is the most likely to be this way? Somebody who was poor, worked their way out from being poor, and now looks back and has no sympathy for anybody that's still poor. Especially those that were poor only a generation or so ago. And listen, there's some truth to this one too, because the Bible tells us that you ought to work hard to get out of the poverty that you're in. But we can't have that kind of impatient attitude with people because there are other things that can contribute to that, and not everybody maybe is able to do what you've done. So that kind of impatience that says, forget it, I don't have time for you, do it the way I did it. Well, not everybody is able to do that, and you ought to watch that kind of attitude. Number 3, right in the middle, you can be indifferent toward the poor. You just don't care, whatever. If you're rich, you're rich. If you're poor, you're poor. Who cares? Well, that's not right either. Somebody who is dealing with poverty, who isn't making enough money, who isn't able to afford medicine or food, or who is living in a state that is so far inferior to yours, we can't be indifferent towards that. In fact, Jesus told us to do that. Paul is going out preaching his gospel, and the one thing the apostles added, so to speak, to him was, remember the poor. You're supposed to do that. It's going to come up in the judgment. The sheep and the goats judgment talks about that in the book of Matthew. You can't be indifferent and just say, well, whatever happened is going to happen. No, as a Christian, you're required to be loving towards all people. Number 4, now we start to swing towards the positive, so to speak, side, but it's still not right. You can be infantilizing towards the poor. Where the other person was impatient, you just got to get your act together. Infantilizing people look at poor people and say, those poor things, they can't help it. They can't rise up. The nation is too corrupt. Their job is too awful. And you sort of treat them like little children. and you say, you're too stupid, you're too lazy, you can't get it done, you need me to come in and fix all this for you. And when people come in with good solutions, such as, no, you should have to work and work hard, they say, that's not fair that they have to work hard, those poor little things. Now, that's a very bad attitude that we shouldn't have, because then you're insulting your maker because you're treating this person as being less capable than you or anybody else just because they have less. And that's kind of a sick thing, isn't it? And we see this all the time. That's number 4. And here's number 5. And this is where we see in certain political and economic systems, or even in some theologies, when you are idolatrous towards the poor. When you say that having nothing makes you a better person than having something, that it's more righteous and moral to have less. And usually these are people that are so far out of touch with people that are actually poor that they really have no concept of what they're really like. They say, that's just so wonderful to have nothing. Imagine if you didn't have all you balancing your trust fund. Oh, that's just a better way to do it. And we all kind of, if you're more like me and you're kind of down to the lower end of that financial spectrum, you kind of roll your eyes. Like, it's not sunshine and rainbows, pal. And also, there are a lot of people, the word tells us, that are poor because of their own fault. Do you see all these things kind of flow together, and everybody has to learn one lesson of Scripture or another? You shouldn't be indignant towards the poor, or impatient, or indifferent, or infantilizing, or idolatrous. People are people. They are individuals, and every story is different. And yeah, sometimes there's overlap and there's trends, but the Bible tells us, look, sometimes life is hard and it just beats you down, and sometimes there are people that oppress you. An insurance company, a government, a boss, a family member. Sometimes people get robbed, or they get attacked, or their children are causing trouble, and you have no idea why people are where they are. Take the time to find out why first, and then maybe you can establish a judgment and maybe come up with a solution, but you don't have any default attitude towards any one group of people in Scripture. And you know, the second half of that verse says, the one who is generous to the needy honors God. We have all kinds of different ideas about how best to do this, don't we? This is what we argue about every 4 years around November. What is the best thing to do for the poor? Some people who are more conservative say you ought to make it as easy as possible for them to lift themselves up and just stay out of their way. You're doing more harm than good. Then you got other people that are more liberal that say we got to do everything we can to give them as much as possible. We'll do the lifting, and it's not fair to ask somebody to do something for themselves. You know what? We can have this back and forth all day long. The Scripture had some of both. The Bible has passages that tell us you ought to work hard, and if you're going to be lazy, you're going to be poor. But you've also got the law where the Lord told the children of Israel specifically to make provision for the poor. In fact, it was part of their tax code that this had to happen. All I want to address today is the attitude that you have. Look at people as people that God has made in His image, love them well, have compassion on them, and even if that means tough love sometimes, we should not have any kind of default attitude. Don't let anybody in Washington or Hollywood or wherever force you into their idea by trying to whip up your emotions. Think godly about all things, Christian. God bless you.